This reading is called Two Types of Boundaries. Have you ever wondered why when we resolve to try harder or act nicer or force ourselves to take care of others, it just doesn't seem to work? Things don't feel any better. It's quite likely we didn't take the time to look clearly at our own boundaries and first make sure we listen to and take care of ourselves. What are boundaries? You might try to think of them as a form of property line for our inner self. Once defined, they assist us in knowing what our responsibilities are, but also where our responsibilities end. Although boundaries can take many forms, simply stated, they define clear limits as to what feels safe and appropriate, and they help bring order to our lives. When we define and then strengthen our boundaries, we gain a clearer sense of who we are and what our relationships with others are about. Maintaining healthy boundaries empowers us to decide how we will allow others to treat us, and also provides the assurance that we have the tools to protect ourselves from the painful acts of others. So there are two main types of boundaries: physical and emotional. An example of a physical boundary is deciding who can touch us and how. These outer physical boundaries are contrasted by the emotional boundaries, which, though related, are defined by our requirements for inner comfort. Defining how we will or won't be treated by others is an emotional boundary. Have you thought about the sorts of personal comments you just won't accept or tolerate? These decisions define your emotional boundaries, and emotional boundaries define the self. Certainly, the freedom to say yes strengthens emotional boundaries. It is, of course, important to have respect for the feelings of others and to accept their differences. But the right to say no is just as valid. How we feel is an important source of information in learning to set healthy boundaries. Some of us may have become conditioned to ignore negative feelings, but they can be extremely helpful. Think of them as a flashing warning sign that, like a sign on the highway, directs us away from potential danger to a safer way. By paying attention to and honoring our negative feelings, we can transform them into firm boundaries that, once established, ultimately create a more positive outcome.
Unitarian Universalism that emphasizes the inherent worth and dignity of every person and encourages the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. One aspect of this position is a resistance to boundaries. Unitarian Universalists believe that boundaries, whether they're social, political, or religious, can often be used to divide people and perpetuate inequality and inequities. Instead, we value inclusivity and strive to create communities that are welcoming and accepting of all people, regardless of their backgrounds or beliefs. Overall, Unitarian Universalism embraces a vision of a world without boundaries, where all people are able to live freely and authentically, and where communities are based on mutual respect and shared values. I did not write what I just said. The author is an artificial intelligence program called ChatGPT. I typed in 150 quote, 150 words, Unitarian Universalism, resistance to boundaries, and voila, a few coherent paragraphs about Unitarian Universalism and boundaries appeared. Not a lot of nuances, in my opinion, or feeling, but technically accurate. Now, I give you this as an example of the kind of boundaries in the world we're living into. The world's changing rapidly. Our personal boundaries are constantly tested by technology. Technical changes are happening so fast that we struggle to understand them or to even figure out, is this a benefit or a threat or both? Is it okay to use artificial intelligence to write sermons? What about school papers? How about a sympathy letter to a friend? Will self-driving cars be safe as artificial intelligence increases and improves? You'll need to establish your own personal boundaries about artificial intelligence, but it's here, and it's up to us to determine whether it's a benefit or a harm. Most all religious traditions have well-defined boundaries of what is acceptable behavior and what is forbidden. These are called edicts, mitzvahs, noble truths, the 5 pillars, dogma, creeds, and commandments. Let's look at Christianity's commandments for a while. And most of you have heard of the 10 Commandments, but like all boundaries, there are variations that require interpretation. Some of you may not know that the Hebrew Bible actually has 2 different versions of the 10 Commandments. One found in Exodus chapter 20, verses 2 through 17, and another in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 6 through 21. Now, the 2 versions are similar, but they are different in the order, in the wording, and arguably in meaning. Then it gets even more complicated because the Christian 10 Commandments get a lot more confusing because there's so many different translations of the Bible over the last 2,000 years. There are the Roman Catholic 10 Commandments. These are also followed by the Lutherans loosely. And there are several versions of the Protestant 10 Commandments. And there's also the Jewish version. They're all similar, but they're quite different. Actually, the Jewish tradition has over 600 commandments, not just the top 10. These commandments, also known as boundaries, are specific to the interpretations for specific audiences. When I hear a conservative politician say that the 10 Commandments must be posted in every government building and every school, I can't help but wonder what version he's talking about. I mean, the decision could start a religious holy war. And it's a divisive endeavor that we really don't need to add to the list of the divisions we have. I enjoy a graphic I saw recently, and it's a hammer, a chisel, a blank stone tablet, and the caption says, "Do it yourself 10 Commandments." Since most religious denominations have a set of beliefs and boundaries and creeds that their believers must adhere to, this makes explaining Unitarian Universalism quite challenging. Ours is a covenantal religion without dogma or creeds, but you can't believe anything you want and be a member here. To be part of this community, you must be willing to be in covenant, to be together, to stay together, to walk together, to learn from each other, to respect and care for each other, and to help each other on each of our own individual spiritual journeys. This is a religion with boundaries of behavior. Not all of us agree upon beliefs. Our ultimate goal, of course, is to dissolve all boundaries that separate us from each other. Our vision statement here says this: we envision beloved community for a more humane and just world. And I say that a beloved community has no boundaries between us. There's no them, no others, only us. We value inclusivity and strive to create communities that are welcoming and accepting of all people, regardless of background or beliefs, which means the boundaries of differences have dissolved away. But our goal of beloved community being without boundaries of prejudice or judgment does not mean that we dispense with personal boundaries. So what are personal boundaries? Well, a quote from the book, When to Say No and When to Say Yes, quote, boundaries are personal property lines that define who you are and who you are not, and influence all areas of your life. That bears repeating. Boundaries are personal property lines that define who you are and who you are not, and influence all areas of your life. And healthy boundaries, those that keep you balanced and whole, are essential. Without boundaries, our character melts into a blob of compliance to everyone else's wishes. But understanding what a personal boundary is, and for you to benefit from them by your actions and practices, this is the incredible, difficult part of life. Whenever I set a boundary, along comes an exception. A special case, just this once. For example, my practice, my boundaries, is not to have meetings on Mondays and Tuesdays. These are my study days and my days for correspondence. But there are those special cases, those exceptions that I allow in. And I've come to believe that boundaries are not hard walls. They're flexible barriers that move and stretch and sometimes open up, and sometimes they let people in. Because whenever I try and form a boundary that's rigid and unforgiving in my personal boundaries, I fail. Of course, at my core, I'm a people pleaser, a peacemaker, which means that maintaining my personal boundaries will be a challenge of balance for the rest of my life. The challenging part is when to say yes and when to say no, and when to reevaluate the boundaries that are no longer benefiting me. I used to hate hugging. This was a time in my life when I had a boundary of minimal physical contact with friends for various reasons in my past. But now there's nothing more precious than a good hug to convey my love for an acquaintance or friend. Yet, just because I've changed my personal boundaries and enjoy hugging doesn't mean that you like hugs. If you were abused mentally, physically, sexually during your life, you may shudder and be repulsed by a hug from anyone. And when someone doesn't want to be hugged, this is not a personal rejection of me. It's their personal boundary. And I must respect that. Now, personal boundaries are for yourself and that boundary between us and everyone else. These self boundaries, they're the ones where we try and sustain and lead the life we really want. These include your personal habits, morning rituals, eating habits, and sometimes limiting screen time, for example. Adherence to self-boundaries gives us self-esteem and can be a source of real pride. And violations of self-boundaries can be annoying or even guilt-ridden. When you're addicted to anything, relapses can be horrific, a violation of a personal boundary. Other people boundaries that we have are the kinds of treatment we will accept or reject from others. These are the tougher ones where we must negotiate our responses to historical triggers and behaviors from others. If you're a peacemaker without boundaries, a victim person can take and take and take from you until you are empty. Now, in some cases, personal boundaries can actually save your life. Maintaining personal, healthy boundaries, a lifelong endeavor. And here's my criticism of the culture of figuring this stuff out by yourself and not asking for help. We spend a lot of wasted time trying to build and maintain healthy boundaries by self-help. Maybe you even bought a book. George Carlin says it this way: if you're looking for self-help, why would you read a book written by someone else? He says, that's not self-help, that's help. This is where community and therapy really help. My testimony is that community and therapy saved me, because life is too complicated to go at it alone. My best decisions came after seeking advice, even if I didn't follow it. I got advice. My worst decisions came from deciding on things on my own without input from anyone. That's when personal boundaries must be flexible, even permeable. And this is when personal boundaries must be evolving and changing with your experiences. And that is why I love this religion. Unitarian Universalism balances an evolving set of personal boundaries while existing in a covenantal community. Common goal of building a better world. Personal boundaries, they're essential for a meaningful life of purpose. Without personal boundaries, we lose our identity. Boundaries are personal property lines that define who you are and who you are not, and influence all areas of your life. Blessed be, and amen.